Professor publicly insults Karoline Leavitt, but her response leaves everyone stunned. The lecture hall was packed, every seat taken as students settled in for yet another afternoon of political science. At the front of the room stood Professor Richard Callaway, a tenured scholar known for his sharp wit and, more infamously, his open disdain for certain political figures. He had built a reputation not just as an educator, but as someone who used his platform to make bold statements, and today was no exception. Pacing the room, gesturing animatedly, his gaze suddenly locked onto a familiar face, Karoline Leavitt. The young, rising conservative voice had been making waves in the political world, and her mere presence in the class was enough to draw attention. Students whispered among themselves, curious to see how the outspoken professor would react. Dr. Callaway smirked. "Ah, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's not every day we have someone with such an interesting perspective joining our discussion. Perhaps you could enlighten us. What's it like building a career on, let's say, alternative facts?" A few students chuckled uneasily, while others shifted in their seats. Karoline, sitting near the middle of the room, remained unfazed. She had faced dismissive remarks before, but there was something particularly pointed about this one. Meeting the professor's gaze, she refused to waver. Dr. Callaway's tone grew sharper. "Let's be honest, the kind of rhetoric you promote? It's dangerous. This glorification of traditional values, this refusal to evolve with the times, it's not just regressive, it's harmful. And yet, you present it as some sort of noble crusade."
He scoffed.
"Tell me, Karoline, do you actually believe the things you say, or is it all just for the cameras?" A hush fell over the room. The attack was no longer masked by sarcasm. It was direct, meant to humiliate. Some students looked away, unsure of what to expect. Others leaned in, sensing that this moment was about to become something far bigger. Karoline took a deep breath, then stood up. There was no hesitation in her movements, no trace of anger or embarrassment. If anything, she looked prepared. Tilting her head slightly, she considered her words before speaking. "Dr. Callaway," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I understand that you have strong opinions, and I respect your right to express them. After all, true intellectual discourse is about engaging with different viewpoints, not silencing them." The professor raised an eyebrow, unimpressed, but Karoline wasn't finished. "You see, I grew up in a working-class household. My parents taught me that hard work, faith, and love for this country aren't just slogans. They're real values that shape lives. The people I advocate for aren't extremists, as you imply. They're Americans who believe in the Constitution, personal responsibility, and the right to speak freely, without being ridiculed in a classroom meant for learning." A murmur rippled through the students. Some nodded in agreement, others watched with growing respect. Karoline's words weren't defensive. They were deliberate, measured, and undeniably powerful. Dr. Callaway folded his arms. "That's a nice speech, Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone laced with forced amusement. "But rhetoric doesn't change facts. The world is moving forward, whether you like it or not. Your brand of politics belongs in the past." Karoline smiled, calm, almost knowing. The world moves forward because people challenge ideas, not because they accept being told what to think. That's why I'm here, Professor. Not to be ridiculed, but to engage in real discussion. If you truly believe in progress, you wouldn't fear dissent. You'd welcome it. Silence filled the room. Students exchanged glances, their expressions shifting, from amusement to something closer to admiration. Even those who disagreed with her couldn't deny that she had held her ground with remarkable composure. Dr. Callaway opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in his long career, he found himself at a loss for words. And what happened next? No one could have predicted it. For the first time in years, Dr. Callaway hesitated. A man used to controlling the room, to delivering the final word that cemented his authority, now found himself unsettled. There was a shift in the atmosphere, one he could feel, even if he couldn't articulate it. The students sensed it too. The smirks, the quiet chuckles that had accompanied his earlier remarks.
Gone.
Now, there was only silence, a hushed anticipation as they waited to see how this would unfold. Determined not to lose control, Dr. Callaway adjusted his stance. The smirk returned, though thinner than before. "Miss Leavitt, I applaud your poise," he said, voice laced with amusement. "But let's not pretend this is about free speech. Your movement, your entire political ideology, thrives on misinformation and fear. You claim to champion free thought, yet you align yourself with those who rewrite history to fit their agenda. So tell me, class, what happens when a society refuses to evolve? When it clings desperately to the past instead of embracing change?" He turned back to Karoline. "It crumbles. That's what happens. And that's why your brand of politics is dangerous. It's built on regression, not progress." A few students nodded, reassured by his words. But others remained silent, their eyes shifting between the professor and Karoline, waiting. Karoline took a slow breath, her expression unshaken. "Dr. Callaway," she said evenly, "you speak as though progress is measured only by how far we move away from the past. But wisdom isn't found in abandoning history, it's found in learning from it. You accuse conservatives of clinging to outdated values, but tell me, when did principles like hard work, faith, and personal responsibility become obsolete?" She let the words settle before continuing. "You say my ideology is built on misinformation and fear, but isn't it fear that drives people to silence those they disagree with? Isn't it fear that makes someone attack rather than engage?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Some students shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the so-called regressive one in the room was not the person resorting to mockery. Dr. Callaway's smirk faltered. Clearing his throat, he tried to brush it off. "Let's not get dramatic, Miss Leavitt. No one is silencing you. You're free to speak, just as I'm free to challenge your ideas. That's the foundation of education." Karoline's smile remained.
Exactly.
"And yet, instead of challenging my ideas, you chose to mock me. Instead of debating, you ridiculed. That's not education, Professor. It's intimidation. And the fact that you're trying to reframe this conversation proves that you know it too." A collective murmur spread through the room. Some students exchanged glances. Others simply sat in stunned silence. Dr. Callaway scoffed. "Oh, please, let's not act like conservatives are the victims here. Your movement is built on exclusion, rejecting those who think differently, demonizing progress. You want freedom of speech, but only when it serves your narrative." Karoline nodded, as if she had been expecting this. "That's an interesting claim," she said, "because right now, I'm the only one being insulted. I haven't called you names, I haven't mocked your beliefs. I've simply responded with reason. And yet, you keep telling me that I'm the one silencing others. Do you see the irony in that?" The room fell silent. The weight of her words settled over the students, forcing them to reconsider the dynamic at play. And then something unexpected happened. Applause. It started with a few students, hesitant at first, then spread. Some clapped quietly, others more enthusiastically. It wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be. Dr. Callaway's face tightened. Turning back to the board, he cleared his throat. "All right," he muttered. "Let's get back to today's lecture."